The country of Sudan is located in northeastern Africa, where it has many neighbors. It is bordered by Egypt on the north and Libya on the northwest. Chad lies along the western border, and the Central African Republic lies to the southwest. South Sudan, which was long part of Sudan, lies to the south. Ethiopia, Eritrea, and the Red Sea extend along the eastern border. Area 712,280 square miles, 1,844,797 square kilometers. Population 2020 est. 44,591,000. Sudan's capital is Khartoum. Khartoum, Omdurman, and Khartoum North are adjacent cities that together make up the country's largest urban area. It is located at the junction of the White Nile, a section of the Nile River, and the Blue Nile, a tributary of the Nile. The Nile Valley and its irrigated agricultural areas are the most settled part of the country. Sudan was ruled by the British and the Egyptians from the late 19th century. It became independent in 1956. After that, Sudan had many changes in government, fluctuating between ineffective parliamentary government and unstable military rule. The country was also racked by conflict between the different populations living in the north and the south. Most of Sudan's people are Muslim Arabs. For more than a century, Sudan also included what is now South Sudan, whose population is largely composed of sub-Saharan African ethnic groups who follow Christianity or traditional African religions. Starting in the 1950s, rebels in the south and the Sudanese government fought 2 decades-long civil wars. A peace agreement finally ended the Second War in 2005. In January 2011, citizens in southern Sudan voted to become independent, and on July 9, 2011, South Sudan officially seceded from Sudan. Land and climate: Sudan is mostly a land of flat plains. The northern part of the country consists largely of sand or gravel-covered desert that is part of the Great Sahara. In the west, wind erosion caused by the northeast trade winds has created a vast sand plain, the Kaz, with rippling sand dunes. An extensive clay plain stretches through south-central Sudan. Plateaus and mountains are located mainly near the borders. The Red Sea Hills, the most extensive highlands in Sudan, are in the northeast. In the west, near the border with Chad, the volcanic Mara Mountains rise out of the Darfur Plateau, reaching elevations between about 3,000 to 10,000 feet (900 to 3,000 meters) above sea level. The Nuba Mountains, a group of isolated hills, rise abruptly from the south-central clay plain. Uplands also line the border with Ethiopia in the southeast. Through the middle of Sudan flows the Nile River. All streams and rivers of Sudan drain either into or toward the Nile. Its waters rise in Lake Victoria and cross Uganda and South Sudan before flowing northward through southern Sudan. When it enters Sudan, the river is known as the White Nile. The Nile's largest tributary, the Blue Nile, also flows through Sudan. From its source in the highlands of neighboring Ethiopia, the Blue Nile follows a northwestward course in Sudan. The Blue Nile joins the White Nile at Khartoum to form the main branch of the Nile, which then flows across the desert into Egypt. Most of Sudan is characterized by a hot, dry climate. The Libyan and Nubian deserts, subdivisions of the Sahara, cover the north. Here it is dry year-round. In central and southern Sudan there are 2 seasons, wet and dry. Khartoum, at the edge of the desert, has significant rains only during July and August. Its annual precipitation averages between 4 and 8 inches, 10 to 20 centimeters. At the desert's edge, precipitation is minimal and extremely variable, with droughts common. The southernmost part of the country has a longer summer rainy season, receiving some 20 to 30 inches, 50 to 75 centimeters, of precipitation annually. Temperatures in Sudan are some of the hottest in the world. The central and eastern areas have the highest mean annual temperatures, typically ranging from the mid-90s to mid-100s F, mid-30s to low 40s C. In the west and northwest of the country, the highest mean temperatures generally range from the mid-80s to mid-90s F, low to mid-30s C. The highest temperatures normally occur just before the summer rains and the coolest temperatures during the winter months of December and January. Along the Red Sea the climate is alleviated by sea breezes, and most of the rain falls during winter. Plants and animals, with the exception of the Red Sea Hills, northern Sudan is a vast desert with little vegetation. As the precipitation increases toward the south, the vegetation gradually increases. Most of southern Sudan consists of savannas, with short grasses and a variety of acacia trees. Large areas of Sudan's natural vegetation have disappeared because of the effects of centuries of cultivation and because of grass fires that annually may sweep across more than half the country. The advance of the desert from the north presents a further danger to plant life. The country's wildlife includes lions, leopards, cheetahs, elephants, and many kinds of antelope. Among the resident birds are bustards, guinea fowl, and storks. Reptiles include crocodiles and various lizards. Insect life is abundant. Among the domesticated animals are sheep, goats, cattle, and camels. Sudan has several protected nature areas, including game reserves and national parks. Dindar and Radom national parks have been designated as UNESCO Biosphere Reserves. People and culture, Sudan is dominated by Arab Muslims. For the most part, however, these people are ethnically mixed, and many of them are physically indistinguishable from Sudanese who do not consider themselves Arab. Moreover, the country's Arabs do not form a cohesive group, ranging from city dwellers to village farmers and pastoral nomads. Sudan is also home to several peoples who are Muslim but not Arab. Among them are the Nubians, who live along the Nile in the far north and in southern Egypt, the Beja, pastoral nomads of the Red Sea Hills, and the Fur, who are settled farmers living in the Mara Mountains in the far west. The vast majority of Sudan's non-Muslim peoples live in the south. They include the Nuba, of the Nuba Mountains, and the Dinka, who live near the southern border and in South Sudan. The capital of Khartoum, in the center of Sudan, is also home to non-Muslim populations. Arabic is the most widely spoken language in Sudan. It belongs to the Afro-Asiatic language family, as does the Bedawi language of the Beja. Most of the rest of the country's languages belong to two families of African languages, the Nilo-Saharan family and the Niger-Congo family. Since the many different peoples of Sudan speak different languages, the vast majority of Sudanese have become multilingual, with Arabic and, to a lesser extent, English as second languages. Most of Sudan's people are Muslims, nearly all of whom follow the Sunni branch. Smaller portions of the population follow traditional animist religions or Christianity. Sudan's population is mostly rural, with only about a third living in urban areas. The livelihood of the rural people is based primarily on agriculture and pastoral activities. Thus their way of life depends on the availability of vegetation and water resources. In the north, nomadic Arab tribes such as the Kababish wander the desert with their herds in search of the vegetation that grows after the rare desert thunderstorms. In the Nile Valley and in the irrigated Gezira Al Jazeera region, the people lead a sedentary agricultural existence. The abundant sunshine, year-round growing season, and water from the Nile allow the farmers to reap multiple harvests from the land each year. Away from the irrigated areas, people depend on the annual rainy season for crop production. The low amounts and the variability of precipitation force people to grow more drought-resistant plants. In south-central Sudan, many farmers earn a cash income by collecting gum arabic, the sap of an acacia tree. The Khartoum metropolitan area, which also includes Omdurman and Khartoum North, is the largest urban center. It is located roughly in the center of the country. Other principal cities are Niala, in the southwest, Port Sudan, the major port, on the Red Sea coast in the northeast, and Al Ubaid, in the south. Access to health services in Sudan greatly depends upon geographic location. Most of the country's small number of physicians are concentrated in the urban areas, as are the major hospitals. Varying ecological conditions, poor hygiene, and widespread malnutrition result in a high incidence of fatal infectious diseases. The most common illnesses are malaria, measles, and tuberculosis. When Sudan became independent from Great Britain in 1956, it inherited a limited educational system. In the 1970s, major changes in education emphasized basic literacy, and the number of primary schools was expanded. Further reforms were later introduced, including making 8 years of primary education compulsory beginning at age 6. As a result, the number of adults who could read and write increased from roughly 20% in the 1970s to more than 75% in the early 21st century. There is still a major shortage of schools and teachers, however. Sudan has a number of institutions for higher education. The University of Khartoum was formally established in 1956. Other universities include Al Nilain University and Sudan University of Science and Technology, both in Khartoum. Omdurman Islamic University, which trains Muslim clerics and scholars, is in Omdurman. Arabic is the primary language used in the country's schools. Economy: Sudan is one of the poorest and least developed countries in the world. About 4/5 of the labor force works in agriculture. The major crops that farmers raise to feed their families are sorghum and millet, grown in the rainy region of southern Sudan. Many Sudanese households keep some livestock, particularly in the rural areas. Sheep, goats, and cattle are the most commonly raised animals. Livestock are also an important agricultural export. The main cash crops include cotton, peanuts, groundnuts, sesame, gum arabic obtained from acacia trees, sorghum, and sugarcane. The agricultural heart of Sudan is the irrigated region between the Blue and the White Niles, known as the Gezira Scheme. One of the largest irrigation projects in the world, the scheme covers roughly 2.5 million acres, 1 million hectare, providing water for more than 100,000 farmers. It was begun by the British in 1925 with a dam at Sanner on the Blue Nile to supply their textile industry with high-quality cotton. Cotton is still the principal crop in the region. Manufacturing is not well developed. It is dominated by the processing of foods and other agricultural products, including sugar refining, cotton ginning and spinning, leather tanning, and the production of vegetable oils. Petroleum was discovered in southern Sudan in 1977, but exploitation and development of the oil deposits were slowed by the civil war that began in the 1980s. Oil ultimately became Sudan's most valuable export. When the South seceded in 2011, however, the majority of the oil reserves fell within the borders of the newly independent South Sudan. Gold is mined in the Red Sea Hills. In the west near the borders of Chad and the Central African Republic are uranium reserves. Sudan also has deposits of chromite, gypsum, mica, marble, and iron ore. However, most of these resources have not been extensively developed. Sudan's principal exports are petroleum, gold, livestock, cotton, gum arabic, sesame products, and peanuts. Major imports include machinery, wheat, transportation equipment, and other manufactured products. The United Arab Emirates is Sudan's leading trading partner. Others include Egypt, Saudi Arabia, India, Turkey, and Japan. Transportation in Sudan is not well developed. Most of the country's all-weather roads and railroads are in the east, linking Khartoum and the Gezira with Port Sudan on the Red Sea. A rail line also runs westward from Al Ubaid to Niala, with a branch line extending to Wau, in South Sudan. Sudan is linked to Egypt by a railroad from Khartoum to Lake Nasser, the artificial lake created by the Aswan High Dam in Egypt. Port Sudan, located 850 miles (1,400 kilometers) south of Suez, Egypt, is the country's main port. Several air carriers, including Sudan Airways, the national airline, furnish domestic and international service from the major airport at Khartoum. There are a number of smaller airports, including those at Al Ubaid and Port Sudan. Sudan's landline telephone network is limited and has a relatively small number of users. Cellular phone use is much more pervasive, particularly in urban areas. Internet service is available in many of the main cities and towns. Broadcast media are owned and controlled by the government. Print media has slightly more freedom and may be privately owned, though the government exerts considerable control over content. Government and history. Early history. In ancient times, the land that is now Sudan was part of a region known as Nubia. From the end of the 4th millennium BC, Nubia periodically came under Egyptian rule. Sudan was part of the Kingdom of Kush, or Kush, which arose in southern Nubia, from the 11th century BC to the 4th century AD. Kushite culture was strongly influenced by Egypt, especially in the use of hieroglyphs and pyramidal architecture. In the 8th century BC, the Kushites invaded and conquered Egypt. The kings of Kush ruled as Egypt's 25th dynasty for less than 100 years, however, before they were pushed back to Nubia. Soon afterward, the Kushites moved their capital to Meroe, near the Nile, about 100 miles (160 kilometers) north of what is now Khartoum. Today, major Kush ruins are found at Meroe. After the destruction of Meroe in AD 350 by an Ethiopian army, there eventually arose a number of Christian kingdoms along the Nile north of Khartoum. Christianity was brought into the region by Coptic missionaries from Egypt. These Christian Nubian kingdoms reached their height in the 9th and 10th centuries. They coexisted with their Muslim Arab neighbors in Egypt for centuries, until an influx of Arab immigrants brought about their collapse in the 13th–15th centuries. Two Arab sultanates eventually consolidated their control over most of what is now Sudan by the 16th century. Egyptian and British rule, the Arab sultanates fell under the control of Egypt, which was itself ruled by the Turkish Ottoman Empire, in 1821. By 1874 the Egyptians had conquered the entire Sudan region, including what are now Sudan and South Sudan. The slave trade was greatly expanded and pushed into what is now South Sudan. The various sub-Saharan African peoples of the south, who were primarily Christian and animist, were enslaved by the Muslim Arabs of the north. The hatred engendered by the slave trade still persists. The Egyptians encouraged British interference in Sudan. This aroused Muslim opposition to Egyptian rule. Muhammad Ahmad proclaimed himself the Mahdi, meaning the divinely guided, and organized a resistance movement. His followers laid siege to Khartoum and overwhelmed Anglo-Egyptian forces on January 26, 1885. The Mahdi established a Muslim state, but he died of typhus 5 months after the fall of Khartoum. The Mahdist state continued under the rule of his successor, who was known as the Khalifa, meaning caliph. Meanwhile, the British had occupied Egypt. They wanted to keep rival European powers out of the Nile Valley. Sudan had been under the rule of the Khalifa for about 12 years when the British invaded to protect the Nile from French forces. A decisive battle occurred at Omdurman on September 2, 1898, when the British, using machine guns and artillery, killed about 10,000 Mahdist fighters and lost only 48 of their own men. After the British conquest, Sudan was ruled jointly by the British and the Egyptians as Anglo-Egyptian Sudan. Sudanese nationalism gradually redeveloped, and on January 1, 1956, Sudan became independent. Independent Sudan, the government of the new country was dominated by Muslim Arabs from the north. The mainly Christian and animist African peoples of the south, which is now the separate country of South Sudan, were largely excluded from the country's administration. A group in the south had begun to rebel against the government in 1955. Civil war broke out, with southern resistance increasing as the government took measures to foster the spread of Islam and the Arabic language throughout the country. The war lasted until 1972 and caused the deaths of more than 500,000 people, primarily from malnutrition and disease. After a series of civilian and military governments, power was seized in 1969 by Colonel Ghaffar Mohammed El Nimeiri. He ruled the country for 16 years. Initially Nimeiri had popular support, his major accomplishment being the 1972 Addis Ababa Agreement that ended the civil war. Civil war between southern rebels and the government began again in 1983. A combination of the war, desperate economic conditions brought on by drought, and a crippling foreign debt resulted in Nimeiri's dictatorship being overthrown in 1985. A democratic civilian government emerged after elections in 1986. The dominant political movement was the Umma Party. The prime minister elected in 1986 was Sadiq al-Mahdi, the great-grandson of the Mahdi and a former prime minister, 1966–67. A new coalition government was formed in March 1989 as a step toward ending the civil war. In June, Mahdi was overthrown in a military coup by the Revolutionary Command Council for National Salvation (RCC), led by Lieutenant General Omar Hassan Ahmad al-Bashir, and the civil war raged on. Upon seizing power, the RCC abolished the constitution, the National Assembly, and all political parties and trade unions and ruled by decree. The RCC was controlled by the National Islamic Front (NIF), a Muslim fundamentalist political party. In 1990 Bashir survived a failed coup attempt. In 1993, as part of a transition to civilian rule, the RCC appointed Bashir president and then disbanded. However, the NIF remained in firm control of the government. The NIF later became the National Congress Party (NCP). The first presidential and legislative elections since the 1989 coup were held in 1996. Bashir won the presidency and was also re-elected in 2000. A new constitution approved by referendum in 1998 called for Islamic law, Sharia, to be the basis for the country's laws and regulations. It also lifted the ban on political parties. Later that year, however, a power struggle between Bashir and the leader of the National Assembly led the president to dissolve the legislature. Soon thereafter Bashir declared a state of emergency. Following his re-election in 2000, Bashir faced grave problems ranging from the civil war to widespread famine. Drought and flooding left hundreds of thousands of people without food or shelter in 2001. Experts estimated that by 2005 some 4.5 to 5 million people had been displaced by the civil war. In early 2005 the government and the Southern rebels finally signed a peace agreement. The agreement set forth a new interim constitution and guidelines for sharing power. It also allowed for Southern Sudan to be administered separately and called for a referendum on independence for that region to be held in 6 years. Sudan's interim constitution established a two-house legislature, consisting of the National Assembly and the Council of States. It also provided for the president to be elected to a 5-year term, renewable once. Islamic law was maintained, though relaxed penalties were allowed for non-Muslims. In the meantime, a separate conflict in the Darfur region in western Sudan had begun in 2003. Rebels launched an insurrection to protest the Sudanese government's neglect of the western region and its non-Arab population. In response, the government supported Arab militias to fight against the rebels in Darfur. The militias, however, also terrorized the civilians in the region and prevented international aid organizations from delivering food and medical supplies. Despite a 2004 ceasefire, by 2007 the conflict had left hundreds of thousands of people dead and more than 2 million displaced. Because of the Darfur crisis, an International Criminal Court (ICC) issued an arrest warrant for Bashir in March 2009, charging him with war crimes and crimes against humanity. Bashir's popularity in Sudan, however, remained unchanged. In April 2010 he was re-elected president. In January 2011, following the terms of the 2005 peace agreement, Southern Sudanese citizens voted on the referendum for Southern independence. An overwhelming majority chose to secede from Sudan. Southern independence was scheduled for 6 months in the future. Many important issues regarding the division of the country remained unresolved, however, including the sharing of its oil wealth and the new borders. Fighting broke out in 2 oil-rich border areas, the disputed region of Abyei and the state of Southern Kordofan. Although technically in the north, Southern Kordofan was home to thousands of people who had fought for the south during the Civil War. Agreements signed in June called for the withdrawal of troops from both Abyei and Southern Kordofan. As scheduled, on July 9, 2011, South Sudan officially became a new country, and Sudan was no longer the largest country in Africa. In the years following the South's secession, Sudan continued to be challenged by ongoing rebel activity in Darfur and the Southern Kordofan and Blue Nile states. The government often used brutal campaigns to quell resistance, deploying air bombardment, tanks, and sophisticated weaponry. Bashir had vowed to defeat rebel opposition by 2015. However, the National Army did not possess the resources or the capability to do so, given the degree of public support for the rebels in their strongholds. The ongoing conflict led many Sudanese to flee from their homes. By the end of 2014 about 650,000 people had sought refuge in Ethiopia, Chad, and Egypt. Another 1,873,000 were internally displaced. Bashir, who had promised to step down from office at the end of his current term, changed course in October 2014 when he accepted the NCP's nomination as the party's presidential candidate in the 2015 elections. Later that year the ICC prosecutor announced that she was suspending the investigation of the case against him in regard to criminal action in Darfur. She did this because the United Nations (UN) Security Council was not taking any action to compel Bashir and other defendants to appear in court. In April 2015 Bashir was re-elected by a landslide. The official results showed that he received about 94% of the vote in the presidential election. The NCP also did well in the legislative elections, winning some 3/4 of the seats in the National Assembly. The election results were dismissed by the opposition, which claimed the polls lacked credibility. There was international criticism of Sudan for not providing a conducive environment for credible elections. Against the backdrop of a deteriorating economy, Sudanese citizens began to stage large anti-government demonstrations in late 2018. Many protesters openly called for Bashir to step down. The demonstrations continued for weeks, sometimes turning violent when protesters and security forces clashed. With the protests showing no sign of abating, Bashir declared a state of emergency on February 22, 2019. He dissolved the central and state governments and, in the following days, appointed military leaders to the state governorships and named a new prime minister. He also banned unauthorized rallies. Protests continued, nonetheless. While Bashir made additional gestures, such as resigning as head of the NCP and reshuffling his cabinet, he refused to step down from the presidency. On April 6, 2019, thousands of demonstrators marched to the compound in Khartoum that housed the military headquarters. There they began a mass sit-in that lasted for days. Although security forces attempted to use violence to disperse the crowds, some segments of the military intervened to protect the protesters. On April 11, the military announced that it had removed Bashir from power, dissolved his government, and placed him under arrest. In a televised statement, Sudan's defense minister indicated that a military council would oversee a transitional government for a period of 2 years, after which elections would be held for a new civilian government. Protesters, however, rejected plans for a military-led transition and demanded that a civilian transitional government be formed instead.